Most guarded celebrities on the planet feel like they were chatting with an old friend over a glass of wine. He has interviewed presidents and pop stars, action heroes and Oscar winners, and through every single one of those conversations, he has made it look completely, effortlessly, almost annoyingly easy. But Graham Norton is 62 years old now. He has been around long enough to have seen everything, survived everything, and crucially remembered everything. And recently, in a series of candid moments at literary festivals, in print interviews, and in unguarded conversations with journalists who caught him in the right mood, Norton has started to say out loud what he spent years keeping behind that famous smile. Because the truth is, not every guest made that job easy. Some of them made it almost impossible. Some of them turned what should have been a breezy, joyful evening of television into something closer to an endurance sport. And now, finally, with the particular freedom that comes when you stop caring what Hollywood thinks of you, Graham Norton is naming names. This is the story of 6 guests, 6 famous, celebrated, powerful people who sat on that red sofa and made one of television's greatest hosts genuinely wish they hadn't shown up. These are not rumors. These are not tabloid inventions. These are Graham Norton's own words, drawn from years of interviews, festival appearances, and the kind of brutal honesty that only arrives with age and experience. Some of these stories will make you laugh, some of them will make you cringe, and at least one of them will make you shudder. Let's begin. The first name Norton mentions when the subject comes up, and he always mentions it first, as though it sits permanently at the front of his memory, is Mark Wahlberg. Now, to understand why this particular night was so damaging, you have to understand what Norton values most in a guest. It is not beauty, not fame, not even wit, though he appreciates all of those things. What Norton values is presence, the ability to be in the room, to listen, to respond, to be a genuine participant in a conversation rather than simply a body occupying space on a sofa. When a guest has that quality, Norton can work miracles. When they don't, the whole thing unravels in ways that no amount of professional skill can fully repair. Wahlberg arrived in 2013 with a kind of energy that initially seemed promising. He was there promoting a film called Broken City, and when he walked through the doors of the BBC studios that evening, he seemed fine, sharp even. Norton has described that first impression with a kind of retrospective disbelief. The man appeared completely sober, completely in control, completely ready for what was going to be a lively night. The other guests were Michael Fassbender and Sarah Silverman, 2 people with genuine chemistry and conversational ability, and the early minutes of the recording reflected that. Everyone was laughing. Everyone was engaged. Norton thought, by his own admission, that it was going to be one of those nights, the kind that feels like it writes itself. And then, somewhere around the 20-minute mark, something shifted. Norton has described it in almost cinematic terms, that moment when he looked across the sofa and realized that whatever Wahlberg had consumed before arriving had finally, fully taken hold. The timing, the awareness, the basic courtesy of letting someone else finish a sentence, all of it disappeared at roughly the same moment. Wahlberg began talking over Silverman, interrupting Fassbender mid-anecdote, and veering into conversational territory that made no logical sense. At one point, in a moment that apparently made the studio audience go briefly silent, he climbed partially onto Norton and put his arm around the host with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who had entirely lost track of where he was and what was expected of him. Norton has spoken about this night at some length at the Henley Literary Festival, and what comes through most clearly in his account is not anger, but exhaustion. He has been careful to note that Wahlberg did not become aggressive or mean. This was not malice. It was chemistry, the wrong kind. The kind that arrives when alcohol meets an empty stomach and a long flight and a studio that is considerably warmer than anyone expects. But the effect on the show was devastating in a quiet, grinding way. Fassbender, who had apparently been building toward a genuinely good story, kept getting derailed. Silverman, who has the comedic instincts to redirect almost anything, found herself at a loss. And Norton, who has made a career out of turning difficult moments into gold, simply could not find the thread. The moment he is cited most often is looking over at Wahlberg during one of Fassbender's stories and finding the Hollywood star completely asleep. Not drowsy, not distracted, asleep, with a particular piece of a man who has absolutely no idea what is happening around him. The audience laughed. Because what else could they do? But Norton has been honest about the fact that it was the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort rather than joy. In the years since, Wahlberg has been fairly breezy about the whole episode, acknowledging that he had a few drinks and suggesting that it was simply one of those wild nights. Norton has been more measured. He forgave, because Norton generally forgives, but he has never claimed to have forgotten. The second name is Mickey Rourke, and this one is different in character from the Wahlberg story, because the problem was not excess, but absence. Rourke, at the height of his comeback, riding the wave of critical admiration that followed the wrestler, should have been a dream guest. He had a story, one of the most compelling comeback stories in modern Hollywood history. He had a face that told its own complicated tale. He had a voice and a manner that were entirely his own. Norton, who has always been particularly good at drawing out the unexpectedly human side of celebrities, should have been perfectly suited to the task of putting all of that on screen in an entertaining way. Instead, Rourke arrived radiating the particular energy of a man who considered the entire enterprise beneath him. Norton has described the experience in terms that are almost comically exhausted. The sunglasses that stayed on, the cigarettes that kept appearing, despite the fact that smoking was not permitted in the studio, the answers that arrived in short, clipped fragments that closed off every conversational path before Norton could walk down it. He has used the word exhausting more than once when describing this appearance, and you can hear in that word not just professional frustration, but something more personal. The weariness of a man who genuinely loves conversation being forced to conduct one with someone who has decided that conversation is beneath him. What makes the Rourke story particularly interesting is that it was not hostility. Norton has been careful to distinguish between guests who are difficult because they are unpleasant and guests who are difficult because they are simply somewhere else entirely. Rourke, he has suggested, was the latter. He was physically present on the sofa, technically going through the motions of an interview, but his attention and energy were pointed firmly in another direction. Every question Norton threw at him landed in a kind of void. The other guests on the sofa that night reportedly did their best to help, trying to draw Rourke into side conversations, attempting to create the kind of momentum that might pull him back into the room. It didn't work. The broadcast that went out that night was the result of significant editing, and even so, the flatness of the energy was something that viewers noticed and commented on. Norton placed Rourke quietly and permanently on a list of guests he would not be booking again, and that decision has stood. When he talks about the experience now, there is something that sounds less like anger and more like philosophical acceptance. Some people are built for this format, and some people are not, and no amount of professional skill on either side can bridge that particular gap. The third name is Kevin Costner, and this one is perhaps the most purely comedic of the six, in the specific way that things can be both genuinely funny and genuinely terrible at the same time. Costner is a serious man. He is an actor who has built his entire career on a kind of solid, reliable, weathered gravitas, the kind of screen presence that works beautifully in long, sweeping films about American mythology and not quite so beautifully on a late-night talk show sofa, where the entire point is to be warm and loose and willing to laugh at yourself. Norton has described the experience of interviewing Costner as something close to hitting a wall, not a hostile wall, but a very solid, very polished, very courteous wall that simply bounced every conversational ball straight back without any spin on it. What Norton found particularly striking was the contrast. When the other guests on the sofa that night, and the name he mentions most often, is Helen Mirren, directed questions at Costner, something changed. Costner engaged with Mirren in a way that was noticeably different from his engagement with Norton, more relaxed, more personal, more like an actual human being having an actual conversation. Norton watched this happen in real time, and has described the experience with a kind of dry, self-aware humor that is very much his signature. There was Costner, suddenly animated and charming, talking to everyone except the person whose show it was. To be clear, Norton has never suggested that Costner was deliberately rude or disrespectful. The read he gives is that Costner simply has a deep-seated discomfort with the particular performance that talk shows demand: the quick wit, the self-deprecating anecdotes, the willingness to be slightly vulnerable and slightly ridiculous in front of a live audience and several million viewers at home. Costner has hinted at this himself in other interviews, suggesting that he finds the format artificial, that he would rather have a genuine conversation than perform one. Norton, who would point out that genuine conversation is literally his job, has found this position somewhat baffling, but he understands it well enough to have moved on without bitterness. They are simply two people who operate on different wavelengths, and the unfortunate thing is that one of them had to sit in that chair and make it work regardless. The fourth name is Robert De Niro, and this is the one that Norton seems to find most genuinely fascinating, in the way that the most interesting puzzles are often the most frustrating ones. De Niro is, by any reasonable measure, one of the greatest actors who has ever lived. His body of work is staggering in its range and its depth. He has inhabited some of the most complex and demanding characters in cinema history, with a completeness that most actors spend their entire careers chasing. He is, in the truest sense of the word, a master. He is also, and Norton has said this with unmistakable affection alongside the exasperation, almost entirely useless on a talk show sofa. The problem is not that De